From the University of Tulsa and Public Radio Tulsa, this is Switchyard, a podcast for people hungry for eye-opening essays, moving fiction, soul-stirring poetry, and honest, thought-provoking conversation. I'm Ted Genoways, editor of Switchyard magazine, and your host. Join me and our lineup of literary all-stars as we think through and hash out our world's difficult and fascinating challenges. In January, just after the inauguration of Donald Trump, Switchyard organized a gathering of journalists from across the country to discuss how we would go about covering the new administration. We gathered together the biographers of Michelle Obama and Mitch McConnell, authors of books about the Koch brothers and the family, about Amazon and Google and Facebook, about the rise of white supremacy and the cash value of racism. We featured writers and editors for the New York Times, the LA Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and Mother Jones, for StoryCorps, This American Life, and Reveal. We also had musicians, filmmakers, novelists, essayists, and poets. As we had hoped, the gathering was a source of solace, a call to action and a chance to recommit ourselves to our values and best practices, and a rekindling of our belief in the power of storytelling in all its forms. In these unprecedented and difficult times, we are once again reporting on a president who characterizes journalists as enemies of the state and jokes about killing us. And he empowers and emboldens state and local officials to indulge their most authoritarian impulses. Here in the heart of Tulsa, on the grounds of the Tulsa Race Massacre and the end of the Trail of Tears, we have state officials who have sought to block the teaching of that history while requiring schools to buy Bibles branded with the new president's name. The solemn question each of our panels addressed: what are we going to do now? In this episode about immersion and deep dives, we hear from Ted Conover, Quraysh Ali Lansana, Christopher Leonard, and Elliott Woods, with responses from Theodore Ross and Esther Honig. Ted Conover is the award-winning author of Cheap Land, Colorado, and numerous other books. He is considered something of the godfather of immersion journalism. Quraysh Ali Lansana is the author of over 20 books of poetry and nonfiction. He is also the executive producer of NPR's Focus Black Oklahoma, a monthly radio program. Christopher Leonard is a business reporter and the author of several books, including The Lords of Easy Money and Cokeland. Elliott Woods is the host of Third Squad, an Edward R. Murrow award-winning podcast, and a long-form magazine journalist who has won an Overseas Press Club Award and a National Magazine Award. Our moderators are Theodore Ross and Esther Honig. Ted is the editor-in-chief of the Food and Environment Reporting Network and author of the book Am I a Jew? Esther Honig is a producer at StoryCorps and a regular contributor to other NPR programs.
I love all of these side conversations so dearly. I love looking out and seeing all of these beloved people from different phases of our careers and work lives that Marianne and I have had together, and to see people from disparate parts of that in conversation with each other. I hate interrupting every single time. That said, we are back and we are right on schedule. This is a panel on immersion and on deep reporting. I feel like, given that subject, that I would just want to remind everybody, I'm conscious. I want long form, but I want it to only be as long as it has to be. Thanks very much, guys.
Welcome, everyone. As Ted said, this is Immersion, what the media gets wrong when they don't go deep. My name is Esther Honig. I'm an audio journalist. I do long form, but at my day job, I am a producer for StoryCorps. So I actually make stories that are no longer than 2 minutes and 30 seconds. So ironic that I'm up here. I know you all are feeling very awake, very fresh, that you're hungry for more knowledge and more conversation. So thank you for joining us. And now I'll just pass it off to my co-moderator, Ted.
I'm Theodore Ross. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Food and Environment Reporting Network. And I'd like to hear from all of you. Why don't we start with you, Elliott? You go first.
Okay, so I'm Elliott Woods. I've covered a lot of different things in my career as a journalist, which began at a little publication called the Virginia Quarterly Review, where my very first editor, who gave me an internship where I pretty much did nothing, but then gave me an assignment that launched my career as a journalist, was a man named Ted Genoways, who I'm very grateful to and who I now count among my greatest inspirations and greatest friends. So I started my career mostly covering the Middle East and Afghanistan. I went to Afghanistan 5 times over the course of about 2.5 years during what was called the Obama surge from 2009 to 2012. I also lived in Gaza City for about 1.5 years. I went in during Operation Cast Lead, where over 1,000 civilians and something like 10,000 homes were destroyed, along with tons of public infrastructure, which to me at the time seemed like a totally incomprehensible and unfathomable amount of death and carnage for no purpose other than collective punishment. But since then, I've covered environmental issues, extreme sports, politics, immigration, the gun industry, right-wing extremism, and probably some other things along the way too. I think my beat is basically best described by the acronym ADHD. So I can turn it in a lot of different directions. So this might get pretty weird. So I hope you'll go along for this ride with me. I've been thinking about what I wanted to say here for the last month or so. And I also just want to say how much of an incredible honor it is to be here with all of you, and how much I've been moved and heartened and encouraged by everything that I've heard on this stage and in these side conversations so far this weekend. It is tremendously edifying for me and important, because Siddhartha Deb just said everybody belongs, but I'm sure a lot of you can relate that for people who stare reality so hard in the face, it can be hard to feel sometimes that we belong anywhere. I'm sure all of you have had the experience that I've had of ruining dinner parties by answering the question honestly, so what's going on with work these days? So I'm going to try to make an argument for doing journalism with a strong moral conscience and with a strong sense of moral conviction, which is not the same as moralizing, and it's not the same as sermonizing, and it's not the same as being preachy. But I know that I do what I do from a strong sense of moral conscience. And one of the ways that I know that is because what's been happening over the course of my life as a journalist is demoralizing. And it wouldn't be demoralizing to me if I did not feel like the moral values that I hold dear and that fuel all of my work are being compromised and destroyed in front of my very eyes. So like so many of you, I've worked on a lot of things that have only gotten worse, no matter how much I have tried to make them better. In fact, I think that's true of virtually everything that I've ever covered. So I feel like we are living right now, and have been living for a long time, under a psychological occupation, possibly even a form of psychological terrorism. I would like to remind everybody in the room, as if you need reminding, that Trump has been a part of our daily lives, a part of our daily psychic environment for over a decade now, which is longer, well, about as long as the Nazis were actually in power. So I just want to put that out there. So what I want to do is read you some quotes very quickly. I'm going to try to stretch time this way since I can't stretch it that way. So I'm going to talk faster. Okay. So Virginia Woolf, in her unpublished autobiography, said, "The shock receiving capacity is what makes me a writer. A shock is at once, in my case, followed by a desire to explain it." So put that over here. Robert O. Paxton, who's the world's foremost expert on the history of fascism, wrote in his book about Vichy France, which threw a giant hand grenade into the French discourse on the occupation years, said, "During the first year of the Nazi occupation, there were no serious problems of dissent for the regime. Resistance needs some modicum of hope, and this was absent in late 1940. We'll put that right there. Robert Capa, a photographer who was killed in Vietnam and who landed with the troops in Normandy on D-Day in June 1944, who shot the only roll of film that we have from that invasion, said, "If your pictures aren't good enough, you're not close enough." That's another quote that I want you to just think about, and I'll return to all of these. A few years ago, I was down in El Paso covering the Walmart massacre, and also what would eventually become Remain in Mexico, the overflowing shelters on the other side of the border in Ciudad Juarez, and the huge masses of people that were under the bridges in El Paso because they weren't being allowed into the United States. And I met this seminary dropout who had been in the seminary in Mexico City. And he left because he said he couldn't justify talking about abstruse theological questions when there were so many people suffering right outside the walls of the seminary. So he became an immigration activist and worker who basically spends his days at shelters. And he said to me, I was asking him about how he keeps doing what he does. And he said, sometimes just by listening to someone, you give them the freedom that everyone else has denied them. The next one is from my dad, who is a cardiothoracic surgeon, retired a few years ago. He just turned 80. And I've come to understand his father was actually a newspaper journalist. And I've come to understand that my dad actually taught me how to be a journalist because he gave his personal phone number. And then when cell phones were invented, he gave his personal cell phone number to every single one of his patients and their families. And he was always on the phone with these patients. And whenever we would run into anybody at the grocery store, at a restaurant or whatever, who knew him or had any interaction with him, he would spend so long talking to them. And as a kid, it drove me nuts because I was like, Dad, do we have to talk to the checkout person for 40 minutes? And do I have to tell them what I'm doing in school? Like, they don't care. Let's go. And he was like, no, you need to look them in the eye, shake their hand, and listen to them. And what my dad told me when I was covering COVID a few years ago, he said, if you listen to the patient, they will tell you what's wrong with them. The next quote comes from Joseph Stalin, who said, a single death is a tragedy and a million as a statistic. In a recent essay, Marilyn Robinson, who I love, and I'm sure many of you do as well, was writing about the Iraq War and its aftermath and its relation to our current political situation. And she said regarding the 4,400 U.S. soldiers killed in Iraq, our civilization was deprived of some 220,000 years of productive life. I'm not speaking here of economic loss. Our tendency to bring this measure to bear on virtually everything is a disheartening and destructive habit. The next quote comes from Albert Camus, who is my patron saint. He said, we must imagine Sisyphus happy. And the next one comes from Joseph Conrad, who said, my task is by the power of the written word to make you hear, to make you feel. It is before all to make you see. That and no more, and it is everything. And finally, in the Seamus Heaney of translation of Beowulf, after Beowulf is killed in his final battle with the dragon, to which he's accompanied by only one brave knight because all of the other knights are corrupted. Sound familiar? This one brave young knight named Wiglaf goes with him. Beowulf dies, and Wiglaf is responsible for bringing the sad news of Beowulf's death back to the community, and he sends a rider to ride up on the hilltops among the people and deliver the news of Beowulf's death. And the way that Heaney translates this, speaking of the rider, he says, he told the truth and did not balk, the rider who bore the news to the clifftop. So I want you to think about all of those quotes, and now I'm going to talk really fast and move through all of these one by one and hand it over. So Wolf, the shock receiving capacity. That's also what made me a writer. And the big shock that I experienced was participating in a war crime on a colossal scale that went by the name of Operation Iraqi Freedom. I was a combat engineer in the Army, and I served a year tour in Iraq and then went on to college where I met Ted. And his first assignment that he gave me was actually to go interview the families of the soldiers from my unit whose sons had been killed by a suicide bomber when I was there. So I didn't become a journalist out of intellectual curiosity because I thought it was a cool job, even though both of those things were active in that decision. I became a journalist because I was pissed off and I was sad. I was absolutely heartbroken. And I was also ashamed of having pointed my weapon in the faces of people who meant me no harm, did me no harm, and whose country I had invaded. So I went back to the Middle East, fueled by an irrepressible urge to understand and explain that event to myself and to other people, but also to approach the people of the Middle East on their terms as human beings instead of enemies and targets. After all, we were the insurgents. So what I've taken away from that over the years is that we should never lose the capacity to be shocked. And we should resist the numbing force of propaganda, the flood of information, the ever escalating flood of increasingly more and more outrageous information that can put calluses on us and near us to how fucked up the world is that we live in right now. We should always be able to be shocked. Now, with Paxton, who said that there's basically no resistance without hope, we are now in a state of shock and despair after Trump's reelection. And we need to process those emotions and ask if we're outraged by what we have just lost, by what is at this moment being stolen from us, torn down before our eyes. What exactly is it? What are we willing to fight, possibly to risk discomfort, detention, disgrace, and even death to defend, as our Russian and Mexican colleagues have always done? Which is to say, what values, what moral conscience drives us, and what values will we defend and rebuild? So when Robert Capa said that taking good photos requires getting close, what did he mean? For me, close is not a matter of physical proximity alone. Capa did not mean that we should take macro photos or view people through a microscope. He meant moral proximity, inhabiting the same human condition as our subjects to the greatest extent possible. And by the way, I hate that word subjects. There's just not really a better one. And the brief sidebar there is that they're not really characters either. They're fully fledged human beings who deserve to be respected as such, no matter how crazy they might seem or how much we dislike them personally. So the seminary dropout and my dad together, the seminary dropout said, sometimes by listening to people, we give them the freedom that everyone else has denied them. And my dad, who said, if you listen to the patient, they'll tell you what's wrong with them. This to me is the antidote to the plague of superficiality that has gone fully viral with social media, 140 characters to express thoughts, media discourse defined by sound bites and short clips and spin and all of that. The antidote to me is to go sit with people, to bear witness, to actually be with them. And in the end, that may be the only thing that we are able to offer them, which is why Camus' book, The Plague, which was actually written about the Vichy occupation, which I didn't know until I was much older than the first time I read it, but that's what it's really about. It's about what happens to people under those kinds of conditions and what is possible in a society where that repression is happening. And his protagonist is actually a doctor who realizes very clearly that he has no medical resources to offer the people who are dying of this plague. And what he does is he goes house to house and he spends time with people and he sits with people. He sits with their pain, their sadness, their fear, their anger, and his own. And he recognizes very early on that that's really the only thing that he has to offer them, which is, I think, what that seminary dropout was trying to tell me, because I had asked him, how do you keep doing this when it's clear to you that nothing ever gets better for the people that you're trying to help? Things only get worse. And that's when he said, sometimes by listening people, you give them the freedom that everyone else has denied them. So Sterling Harjo said, when he was talking at lunch, he said, what are journalists supposed to do? No, I don't know. He said, it's fucking crazy. What are you supposed to do? I don't know. Well, I don't know either. But Camus in The Myth of Sisyphus talks about the leap of faith that we have to make when we're confronting an absurd world. To make meaning in that world, we have to make a great leap of faith. And for me, I act on the faith and the hope that our efforts at human connection, which to me, that's what journalism is about, and truth-telling, that they help build a durable fabric and they make the world less lonely, more bearable, less absurd, and maybe bend the moral arc of history toward justice millimeter by millimeter. And that may be the best that I can do. And if the work that I do does more than that, then that's wonderful. And I sure hope it will, but I can't believe that it will. I have to act on something much more simple. And I think it's worth it. And I'm so glad that the rest of you apparently do too.
Thank you. That was amazing. Sisyphus is a great example to keep in mind for reporters these days. So I'm Chris Leonard. I'm an author, investigative reporter, and I'm a director of this thing called the Watchdog Writers Group that gives grants to authors to really go deep and do an investigative reporting book, while at the same time we hire students at the Missouri J School to be reporting assistants and to learn through doing and help those authors. So obviously the entire purpose of that endeavor is to go deep and do this kind of journalism with the goal, very simple goal of unearthing the truth and communicating the truth to the people to enlighten our civic public. Now, that's a Sisyphean job these days. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the context in which we're trying to do that job, and then a little bit of how I see doing that job of going deep. So in terms of the context, I think we can pretty well say that the re-election of Donald Trump is the obituary for the idea that we have a shared truth in the United States. We never had a completely shared reality together, as we've talked about here. But Trump himself is a creature of these totally opposing narratives. To some people, he's an authoritarian fascist dictator who's going to dismantle our democracy on behalf of the rich. To his supporters, he's actually their tribune, buoyed into Washington by the power of democratic forces, is how they see it and talk about it, as their champion who's going to dismantle a corrupt regime and the deep state that's betrayed the working class. Two totally diametrically opposed views of what's going on. And this death of shared truth is the context in which we're trying to do this work, which is intimidating sometimes. And I really was thinking about this. Here's a specific example. The recent wildfires in Los Angeles, right before Trump's inauguration, an enormously important public event for America. And what struck me was that the way millions and millions of people got their news about this event was through the dominant ecosystem of our world today, this plague of superficiality that you just talked about. They got their news from TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and podcasts, which is another way of saying they got their news not from reporters, but from personalities whom they trust, who instantly analyze and narrativize events to their fit narrative of the world. When you listen to Steve Bannon's War Room, the fires were a symptom of our corrupt, liberal, illegitimate regime that has betrayed the people and left them vulnerable to fire. When you listen to Democracy Now! And Amy Goodman, you hear experts explain how this wildfire is a symptom of increasingly cataclysmic climate change, corrupt public policy that has limited any action on climate change to benefit fossil fuel companies. What this means is that the American people emerge from this event with diametrically opposed views about what it means and what we should do about it, which leaves American politics like this system of colliding weather systems, where you've got one gust of energy from people who want to fight climate change, support renewable energy, reduce fossil fuel use, and then that weather system creates this reactionary gust of drill, baby, drill, get rid of the Green New scam, what we're seeing now, withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accords. So as somebody who's in this business of doing deep dive journalism to try to unveil truth, it can feel hopeless to drop truth into that environment when people are living in these silos of different understanding. But in fact, I see, when I look at that ecosystem, original reporting is the headwaters of the narrative. It's like a spring in a hillside with fresh water coming out that comes down and feeds the entire stream below. All of these influencers are doing no original reporting whatsoever. They're reacting to it all. And if the headwaters of original reporting were to dry up, the whole system would atrophy and disappear. So what I'm trying to say here is that even in this environment, original reporting, which is like my thing in life, and storytelling through it, is the dynamic core force that drives these narratives. And if I could say it really is important now, it's not a dead cause. American politics is highly volatile, unpredictable, contingent, and contendent. And what we're seeing are these collisions of narratives, and all narratives are built from stories, the kind of stories we're writing, the kind of stories we're doing. And we don't know what's going to happen with Trump, but I can guarantee you one thing, even the people in the Trump arena know their hold on power is insecure. They've got a year and a half before the midterm elections, and God knows what we're going to see. This could be the permanent end, but it also might not be. So the stories that are flowing out into our ecosystem are still vitally important and drive it. So quickly, going deep, I think you can do it in two ways, vertical and horizontal, which I know sounds cheesy, but going deep vertically is that reporting where you drill down, going through the documents, interviewing the people, going at it for years and years and years to try to get a picture of what's really going on. But the horizontal aspect is just as important. The most thrilling thing about being a journalist is that you get to skip across these silos of our society. You can talk to people from all different walks of life, and it's, I hate to say, more important now than ever to do that, but to understand the people who voted for Trump, to hear their point of view, to talk to the people in that system of power, to talk to the people who are affected by it. That's the job of a reporter. So to me, that's what going deep is. And when we lose the original reporting and going deep, we really do lose everything. I've just got to close because I'm over 5 minutes by saying the original storytelling and reporting still is the vital source at the heart of these narratives that are colliding in our political life right now. And that's what drives the entire weather system. So I still do think it's vitally important.
Thank you, Chris. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Quraish Ali Lansana. Most folks call me Q, and it's an honor to be here with all of you doing this work that makes us crazy often, this work that we must do. I'm going to try in these 5 minutes sort of address this idea of immersion via my own personal story and the work in which I engage. So I am multi-afflicted. We have many afflictions. I'm a journalist, historian, I'm an academic, and I'm also a poet. And I am proudly the last protege of Miss Gwendolyn Brooks from my time in Chicago. And Miss Brooks had 2 quotes. Well, she had many quotes, but there are a couple of quotes that I want to lean in on today with regard to this topic and my work for sure. And one of those quotes is, if I ever needed a poem, all I had to do was look out of the window. There was always a poem dancing or screaming outside. So when I think about that in terms of my work, in all of those afflictions, I think about the idea of observing. Miss Brooks considered herself an observer first. So what are we observing as journalists, as academics? And what are we doing with those observations? And how do those observations engage the folks whom we believe anyway, would benefit from this information? I don't want to say need, because a lot of folks need a lot of different things, right? Like I need a drink right now. But what folks will benefit from this information, right? And I'll get to the second quote in a minute, but I spent a lot of time, as I mentioned, I spent half my life in Chicago. I did some special projects, work with WBZ, Chicago Public Radio, and didn't know I was going to end up back in Oklahoma, but after being away for 30 years. So the program that I produce and created is called Focus Black Oklahoma. And it airs on 2 of the NPR stations here in Oklahoma and then lives in perpetuity in podcasts. Focus Black Oklahoma, or FBO, we engage in what you all know this phrase, citizen journalism, right? But I want you to think about citizen journalism in a state where all 77 counties have voted red since before Bill Clinton. Think about privileging the stories of people of color, of marginalized communities, of poor, rural, primarily white communities in a state that doesn't want to pay attention to any of these folks other than counting their votes. So in the process of engaging and training history teachers and social workers and college students and high school students to engage in NPR style, to learn journalism 101, and then put a mobile recording device in their hands and say, go tell the stories that are important to you and to your communities, and bring them back, and I will edit them, and we will put them, my audio producer team will edit them, and we will put them on the air, and they will live. That kind of immersion to me, that we are empowering everyday people, right? I didn't even put the V in there, everyday. We are empowering everyday people to take ownership and stock in observing, validating what's important to them, collecting interviews and information, and then bringing them back and then putting it on the air. That, to me, again, is an important part of my question of how I address this idea of what the media is doing wrong. What the media is doing wrong is not privileging voice, original voice, and that comes from the ground. That comes from community. And in the process of the citizen journalism, we won a DuPont Columbia Award. Like, how do a bunch of folks who didn't go to your school, which I wanted to, by the way, but I didn't get it. I went to OU instead. But how do we engage a bunch of folks from the community and be nominated for a Peabody, right? So we must be doing something right. And that something right to me isn't about my journalism background or my NPR experience. It's about empowering folks to tell the stories that are important to them and to keep doing it. And yeah, we're a nonprofit, and yeah, we're barely hanging on, but we've been here 6 years doing this work, right? So I'll just leave to you a couple of things. One, that I've been approached this past week about removing the word Black from the title of our program, because that's the world in which we live. That's not going to happen. And then lastly, and I'll leave you this, and maybe we'll come back to this. When we talk about this idea of immersion and truth, many of you here went to the Greenwood Rising History Museum yesterday. And the Greenwood Rising History Museum, I believe, is lacking profoundly in introducing the idea of the history of the district. And why do I believe that? When we talk about immersion and we talk about truth-telling, is that there's very little in that history center that addresses how this district evolved in the face of Jim Crow, how it became one of the most wealthiest Black communities, if not for a time, the wealthiest Black community in the world before it was destroyed. That's a part of the truth that's lacking in that center. That's a part of the truth that's lacking often in the rendering of that narrative, certainly post-centennial. And that's a part of the truth that comes from the community that we must immerse ourselves in. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Q. Thanks, Chris, Elliot. Thanks, all of you. I aim for 4 minutes because I know this audience has been receiving a lot of words today and don't wish to prolong that unduly. My name's Ted Conover. As a journalist and writer, I'm best known. Somebody else gave me this label of being an immersion journalist, and I think what they were talking about is my tendency to spend an extended period of time with somebody unlike me whose experience seemed important to understand. And I'm best known for doing this for almost a year as a corrections officer at Sing Sing Prison in New York. I think it worked really well as an approach because I was able to write about something super important, which was the incarceration crisis, without seeming perhaps to take a side, right? I'm a corrections officer doing a job associated with police repression, but I'm also trying to do it in a humane way and talking about what a hard job that happens to be and how bad it feels to do that job a lot of the time. Anyway, we're at a moment in our history right now where it's hard to find projects that don't clearly seem to be a project of the left or a project of the right. And to find a viewpoint with which you're not immediately going to lose the interest of a huge number of potential readers. Another problem with this whole idea of going deep is it takes a lot more of a commitment on the part of your readers or listeners to read that book or that long form article, those 6,000 to 10,000 words, than it does to listen to that influencer on TikTok or Reels summarizing somebody else's original reporting, as you were saying, Chris, in 30 seconds. I always tell my students that's our competition, is those people on screens. And that's who we're losing a lot of readers to. I think for the documentarian, the journalist, to put themselves in a position really close to the subject is a really good way to establish authority. Okay, I could interview 50 prison employees, but I'm not going to know the same kinds of things that I could learn by doing it for a couple days. And to do it for months, I'm going to learn a lot. So I think this is, while we're looking for solutions for how to not just preach to our choir, but reach a wider audience, I like this idea of establishing authority through experience, spending enough time with people that you have some claim to understand what's important to them. Now, the baseline for this whole enterprise is you never are going to know completely. And I like to make that clear from the very beginning. I'm never going to really know what it's like to be a corrections officer because I could leave tomorrow and it's not my career. I'm not going to know because I went to college, which makes me a bad corrections officer in a lot of ways because I'm curious about people and that makes the job much harder. There's all kinds of things I'll never get, but by spending time and working at it, I truly think you can go a long way, and you just need to avoid the claim of knowing more than you could. All that said, we need to put ourselves out there. We need to make contact. I'm a compulsive maker of contacts. I was leaving the hotel, the Fairfield, last night, and in the elevator was a couple about my age from Kansas City walking to the Kane Ballroom, as so many of us were. They were there because their son's a musician. I talked to them all the way into the ballroom. And I think it was within the last hour, somebody was saying how important it is to talk to everybody and not to think you're better or somehow more important than other people. That's a base principle for me. We talk to everybody. And if you can talk another language, more points to you. And if you can even try to speak in another language, if your español no es tan bueno como debe de ser, forgive me, Antonio. Hey, at least you're trying, right? And maybe you'll earn a few points. Journalists should be able to cross barriers, and we should invest as much energy as we can in doing that. Thank you all for being here.
So I'm going to take the first question for you. And I think what's really great about this panel, I mean, all the panels are great, but this one has 4 practitioners of immersion journalism who are very successful at it, been doing it a long time in very, very different ways. Each bring a very specific and discrete approach to the idea of immersion journalism. Now, one of the assumptions that's baked into the panel is it's hard for you to do this in the modern media environment, right? That there are impediments to you doing this very specific kind of journalism that are unique to right now. So I wonder if you could talk about that. Do you agree with that sentiment? And also, going forward and in this new administration and this new reality in the country, how do you plan to adjust to the kind of journalism you are known for doing in what is a very new set of circumstances? Any of you can take it first.
Gosh. Okay. Totally awesome. I just jumped in to talk and forgot the question, but that was a 2-part question. And the first part was how it's getting more difficult to do this work. And the second part is how are we going to adjust? Okay.
What are the barriers? What are you going to do about it?
Yeah. Whew. The barriers are immense. I do a totally different kind of immersion thing where I try to develop authority by getting obsessed with an institution and just going at it. So here's one of my hobby horses is that there has been a totally toxic dynamic in journalism whereby people think that the important thing is for the reporter to be smart, a smart person sitting at a desk sharing smart thoughts. I'm viscerally opposed to that. I think a good journalist has smart sources. And it's to Ted's point about talking to people. So I'm getting to the difficulty of the job, which is that this guy, Gabe Sherman, is a great reporter, described it as like a telemarketing job. And what I mean to say is you've got to fly out to the towns, you've got to knock on the doors, you've got to call 20 people, you've got to get hung up on 17 times. And it's becoming harder to do because the lanes are narrowing in on reporters every day. Not only do we not have enough money to do the job, but the public relations industry has grown like a toxic fungus to where there's 6 PR people for every reporter. There are more and more limits on us. But you've got to react by getting out there more, working harder, making more calls, digging through more documents and doing that. In terms of adjusting to the Trump era, it is kind of to Ted's point of pushing myself out of the comfort zone more. I spent an evening in 2022 with Steve Bannon talking to him in his apartment. And it's not because I like the guy, but as a witness to history, I want to understand where he's coming from and what he's thinking and what motivates that movement. So it's responding by running toward the dumpster fire and doing as much work as you can to understand it. And also, finally, I'll shut up, but when we talk about this collapse of the old school media system and what we're living in today, I actually think it's kind of given back to us something that's been missing in journalism for a long time, which is humility. Media has been so condescending and so insular and talking down to people. And we've got to realize our voice has no more authority than anybody else's now. It's what we can report that matters. And so having humility to listen to people and also to not be attached to the immediate impact of the work, but just doing the work and putting it out to let people react to it as they will. So I'm reacting with harder work and more humility, to be totally honest.
I'm looking for a good way to write about quote unquote mass deportation. And I'm looking forward very much to reading Molly O'Toole's book, but it's not out yet. And I'm in discussion with a couple of publications about how to do this. One of the best pieces I've read so far was by Eli Saslow in the New York Times, where he wrote about the father in Georgia, came to the U.S. at less than 1 year old, grew up here. He's a customer service agent for a car dealership. He's deeply involved with his church, married, 4 kids, subject now to deportation. And his whole community, including his father-in-law, were sympathetic to Trump. So the country is full of people in a precarious position like that right now who are very sympathetic people. I think I'm not going to do this, but wouldn't it be great to talk to that father-in-law about how he could think that, how he could vote for Trump if it's going to subject his daughter's family to dissolution? Talk to anybody who's signing up for all these new ICE jobs that are going to come online, who's going to work in a new, what do they call them, soft-sided detention facility somewhere. These are going to go up apparently in Texas and Louisiana. All kinds of people are going to be implicated, not just as victims, but as complicit in a way of something destructive to their community for a principle of whatever, some kind of purity or nationalism. And there's a lot of those people, but how to find them and how to talk to them is the great reporting challenge. And I love the idea of being with people who are all about the reporting challenge. And how do we figure that out? So, yeah, let's share ideas after dinner.
Absolutely. You said barriers, and what was the second?
What are you going to do about it?
What am I going to do about it? Well, one of the barriers for me is the DEI thought police. And I guess now there's a website now and a hotline where you can call in and report folks who are engaged in diversity, equity, and inclusion work. Maybe we need to go undercover there, Ted. Maybe that's a job. One of the biggest barriers for Focus Black Oklahoma is Elon Musk. I work with NPR. NPR is connected to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. CPB and NPR are both on the chopping block right now. You know this. You know this well. And in this state, there was a bill a year ago that OETA, our PBS station, which to my knowledge remains the most watched PBS station in the country, right? Because of rural Oklahoma largely, right? And access to broadband and so on in places where there are nooks and crannies, right? So in a moment, there's not going to be Sesame Street in Oklahoma. Like, that's going to kill me, right? When I was in grad school at NYU, I was trying to live on Sesame Street. So I think that those are the biggest barriers for the work in which I'm engaged. In addition to this is nonprofit journalism, so we always need a dime. So if anybody got a couple of dimes, holla at your boy. But those would be my barriers, yeah.
So I like to say that I was born as a journalist into the embers of a dying industry. And what I mean by that is that when I became a freelance magazine writer and freelance documentary photographer and multimedia producer, the internet was swiftly cannibalizing the business model on which journalism had been built and on which many of the people who I'd aspired to emulate in my career, including a lot of people sitting in this room, including very especially Ted Conover, who is one of my ultimate all-time crushes. The problem... Yeah. Well, it's true. I mean, look how cute he is. The thing is that the people who were my heroes and who had paved the way for me in many ways by showing the example of the kind of journalism that I wanted to do and the kind of moral ethic that I wanted to pursue in my work were paid about double or more in real dollars, not adjusted for inflation, in the 1970s, what I would ever earn per word or as a story fee in the 2010s. So I have carried as much as $30,000 in credit card debt to fund my own work at least 4 different times, and then taken jobs outside of journalism to pay it off. That is precarious and exhausting. So the positive side of this is that I have a hell of a lot of experience with doing journalism against the odds and with making it work despite the fact that there is no hope of prosperity anywhere for me down the road. that if I ever make a successful living as a journalist, it will be kind of a fluke, especially because I've never wanted to be an editor or a staff writer. No offense to anybody who does either of those things, but I've always wanted to remain completely independent and able to work only on the things that I want to work on, which is a stubborn position that comes with a lot of precarity, but it's the one that works for me. So on the financial side of things, which is extremely difficult and always has been and getting more and more so every day. I mean, one of the publications I worked for a really long time was Outside Magazine. When I started working for Outside and did a few stories for them, I went up to their highest per word rate, which is $2.50 per word. They were constantly, there's no problem with bashing Outside right now because they've been bought by a giant corporation and they're not even the same publication anymore. But by the time that I stopped writing for Outside in the late teens, they were paying online writers about 50 cents a word. Now, to me, there's no difference as the practitioner. There's no difference in the amount of work that I put into an online story and a print story. But the difference in how much I would get paid for them could be 5x, 6x, 10x, something like that. So that is a challenge I'm used to and equipped for. And I think a lot of my colleagues have figured out how to make it work come hell or high water. And a lot of us have also quit and gone elsewhere. A lot of us have become PR people, which to me, PR is like, you want to talk about assimilating into the Borg and joining the dark side. Holy shit. You want to name the friggin' enemy? It's public relations. There's friggin' 20 of them for every one of us, and they control the narrative. But the bigger challenge for me, I think, is so I can deal with that stuff. I can deal with that stuff. I can deal with the threats. I can deal with that stuff. For me, the much, much harder thing is the question that I occasionally get asked from people who I'm interviewing who are in really desperate situations and have had really horrible things happen to them and their families, which is, what's in it for me if I talk to you? Why should I talk to you? And since this panel is about going deep, I've done some kind of newsy stuff, but I've pretty much only ever gone deep. It's just what I want to do. It's the vocation pulled me in that direction. So I'm usually asking people to tell me about the worst thing that ever happened to them and their families, and to tell me about the things they're most confused about, most afraid of, most sad about, most angry about. And sometimes I'm asking them those questions in places where talking to me could mean real harm for them and danger. Right now, I'm working on an immigration project that I've been working on with Ted Ross for the last year and a half about the 53 people who died in the back of a semi-trailer in San Antonio, Texas in June 22. Well, some people in that trailer survived, and I'm in touch with their families. So now I have a question about, do I mention their families at all? How far do I go in even trying to contact these people or trying to tell their stories? I met with their family members and talked in Mexico and Guatemala last summer and spent dozens of hours talking to family members of the survivors. We have a piece coming out here pretty soon where I don't use any of that material at all. One of the reasons is because none of the survivors wanted to talk to me. They're too afraid. Yeah. Another of the reasons that I'm thinking about now, since Trump has been elected, is I'm not sure that even if those survivors did want to talk to me now, that I would want to put them in print at this moment, which would immediately make them targets, because even though there's a visa category for them, a U visa for victims of crime in the United States who are undocumented, none of them have been given it. And the average wait time for one of those visas is 6 years. Damn. That was under Biden and Obama. Do you think that that wait time is going to get shorter under Trump? J'en doute. So the big challenge for me is that I have no good answer to that question. What's in it for me? When somebody says, maybe I'll talk to you, maybe you can come in my house, maybe I'll open my door to you and open my wounds to you, but what do I get out of it? And I can't say, well, I'll give you money. I can't say I'll give your kids education assistance. I'll help you get a visa. I'll help you get access to medical care, all the things they need. What I have to say is something that I used to believe in a lot more than I do now, but I still believe in enough to act on it. And that's what matters. What I tell them is, I believe that your story matters. And I can't tell you what it will do in the world if you tell it to me and if I share it. But I believe that your story is everything, that it matters, that it is deeply, profoundly important. I believe in the value of you and your family, and I believe in your right to be heard and to be remembered. And I want my fellow Americans to deal with the truth that you have to tell. And even as those words are coming out of my mouth, I can hear myself and I'm thinking, what would I sound like to the person that I'm telling this to?
Yeah.
But I say it anyway, because I do actually believe in it. And that for me is the real challenge. And I expect that challenge to get a hell of a lot worse in the coming years. And I'm going to tell you, I'm here for it.
All right. So for my question, I've been thinking about what it was like being a reporter during the first Trump administration. And that at that time, for me, it felt like everything I was reporting was about how things were being destroyed, disassembled, that things that we had gained, we were losing. And that was just all I did for 4 years. And then even more recently, we've come through a pandemic. We've been through a lot as a country since then. And even looking at what's being reported in long form work, even over just like the last several months, I'm still seeing what a lot of people are talking about, like the doom and gloom. And I don't think anyone, including myself, has a lot of appetite for it at this point. I just can't. I see people whose work I want to read and the topics that they're covering, and it's just not something that I feel like I have the emotional bandwidth for. So since Monday, something I have been really perseverating on and thinking about is, what am I going to do differently for the next 4 years or in perpetuity for the rest of my life as a journalist, just given our circumstances, that I don't want to continue to do work that is just that. Like, do I want it to be hopeful? Do I want it to be inspirational? How am I approaching it differently? And I'm wondering if any of you are thinking about that and if you've come to any conclusions on what you might be doing or what those goals might look like for you.
Well, I think it's a balance, right? With Focus Black Oklahoma, we already include humor stories, and we include Black joy and BIPOC joy and LGBTQIA Two-Spirit plus joy stories in our hour-long broadcast, while we also attack some issues that mainstream media are not addressing in those same communities. So I think that there's some balance there to always include joy if you're capable. But the pivot for me is that for the hard news 31 minutes of my 51-minute broadcast, I want my reporters and the stories to pivot to directly addressing the issues that this new administration and his minions are bringing to us. So I'm going to be more prescriptive with my reporters, and I want you to cover this. I want you to cover that. I want you to do this. And hopefully they'll also be open to pitching stories to me that also fit within, I guess, that criteria, for lack of a better word. But I want to address issues head on, and that's how we're pivoting.
It's a great question, because nobody just wants to read heavy news. And it's one of the hardest things is to have your eye on that, but another eye on something funny, something light that'll make you feel good, and to incorporate it somehow. I'm not great at it. I write down every joke I hear when I'm reporting, as I don't remember them, and I think this could be useful, or amusing mistakes I make that might make me seem more approachable and be funny at the same time. But I do think you are far from alone. And I think keeping an audience is remembering that people don't just want to spend their spare time being sad, right?
Totally. I mean, how many of us have heard so many people have tuned out, didn't watch the inauguration, don't want to read the news. And there's something really destructive about this constant news cycle of crisis and terribleness and corruption, and people tune it out. And I think that that's a totally real thing. So my answer to your question might indicate why my work is not more popular. Okay.
Here.
My second book was about the Koch brothers. And actually writing about those people changed the way I see the world. And I'm always taken back to their people who traded commodities, which I know sounds boring. But these were people who intimately knew these complicated parts of our infrastructure. I mean, they knew the details. And they used to talk about not getting sucked in by the shiny object of what was up or down today, but really looking systematically, deeply at the system to place their trades. And I think about news and politics in that way, in the sense that we've got this shiny object every day, but behind that is this incredibly complicated multiple systems of power, to be honest, and really, really important things. And I find myself gravitating way more to that thing behind. And to answer your question of what's going to be valuable to report on right now, but isn't just everything is going to hell, I find, and this gets to the popularity thing, but I think it can be really, really enlivening to readers when they feel like with an immersion story that they're taken behind the scenes and now they understand something new about the world. These complicated systems. Like I'm writing right now about the global weapons trade, selling all these really big, expensive weapon systems to other countries. And there's just this fascinating, complicated bureaucracy that controls this and administers it. And what I'm trying to do is not write a story that's like, the world is going to hell, but like, hey, dear reader, did you know that there's this entire circulatory system of power that revolves around weapon sales? And there are these like overworked bureaucrats in Washington trying to babysit this system and all these things so that when the reader can walk away feeling empowered, like, damn, man, I really understand this thing so much better right now. So I think focusing our attention there to where we're like enlightening, educating is kind of a condescending word, but informing, I think there's real spark in that. And I think people can take hope in that. And I'm also the kind of person who can read these real downer investigative stories, but walk away feeling empowered and good. So it doesn't necessarily have a happy ending, but knowing what my government's doing makes me feel better and empowered. So I think that's a force we can really tap into. It's not that every single one of my books, because they're nonfiction, has an unhappy ending. The bad guys have won at the end of every single book I've written. And yet, I think people can walk away from that feeling like, I understand this thing better. Mm-hmm. And boy, does that make people feel good.
I love that. That was great.
So along with credit card debt, another thing that I have a lot of experience with is nobody reading my work. So
Here.
I'm also used to that. And I think I'm well suited for the moment because I am used to being ignored and writing to a small concentrated audience of very attentive readers versus a large general audience of people who are skimming headlines. And I think that's okay. Something Jeff Charlotte said last night, he said, maybe now is the time not to be thinking about how to engage a bigger audience or not to be agonizing over who we're reaching, who we're not reaching, et cetera, but instead to be very focused on what we're making and making the thing. And to me, that is what has pulled me through really my whole career. And on a personal level, I completely agree, Esther, that the news cycle has been completely overwhelming. It's overwhelming on the level of content, the nature of the content, what's in the pages, what's in those lines of text, what's in those photographs, the visions of the total war, destruction of Ukrainian cities, of Gaza, of ships full of migrants that are capsizing in the Mediterranean, of migrant caravans on the border, of you name it. The content itself is completely overwhelming, but the pace and scale of the content and the delivery forms themselves leave us no rest and no peace. They give us no quarter unless we absent ourselves from them. So that has been my approach since early in the Trump administration. It was like quitting smoking because like most of you, I did that once too when I was very young. It was pretty hard. Like most of you, I am a total news junkie. I'm an information junkie. I mean, it's my most powerful drug to new information. It's a very human thing to want to seek out new information. And for those of us who become journalists, we are especially vulnerable to it. So when Twitter became a thing, I was pretty into that. And then Facebook, the news feed started and I could see all my smart friends, like many of you, posting super interesting things that I never would have come across on my own. I could live all day looking at my computer and then at my phone. And probably in about 2016, it took me a long time to phase it out. I realized I don't want to live my life like that anymore. The iPhone put in this thing in the software that started telling you your screen time for the week automatically on Sunday mornings. That's what mine does anyway. And I remember when they first started doing that, like 6 or 7 years ago, and I pulled it up and it was like, you spent 3 hours on Instagram yesterday. And I was like, what? How did that happen? Because I couldn't picture any time when I was sitting there for hours. It was the accumulation of 2 minutes here, 5 minutes there, waiting in line at the coffee shop, going to the bathroom, whatever. May as well look at Instagram, see what's going on. I said, I don't want to do that anymore. So I started saying, I'm going to focus on quality over quantity. I started reading way more books. I scaled down my news consumption to very minimum. Most days I only scan the headlines now. I read books. I have a couple of magazines that I love to read. They pile up for about a month and then I plow through them over a weekend or so. And I started looking for beauty and opportunities to actually make things and do things that I love, that give me joy, that I can do with my friends or that I can do by myself that make me happy, like drawing, like listening to great music, going to good movies, like cooking meals for my friends. I started doing that more, and I think it has been enormously helpful for me, and I recommend it to the world.
I'm actually going to use that spot and that advice to jump in to say thank you, first of all, to our panelists, another amazing panel. Because you all have to go and enjoy food and culture and a little bit of time to converse with each other before we're back here again at 7 p.m., I want to be sure to give you that time. I also want to highlight exactly on this point that one of the things that we have tried to do all through the program is make sure that we're not just focused exclusively on journalism, but that we've had these discussions of filmmaking and poetry, and that you've had a chance to hear from people who are community leaders. There will be music tonight as part of what we're doing. And so I agree. I think it's important to keep looking for ways to nourish our souls as well as nourishing our bodies, which you have to go do right now. And it is Saturday night in the Arts District, so it is challenging to get in and find some place. I wish you luck. May it be ever in your favor. And we'll be back here at 7 p.m. in order to have our closing program. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Switchyard. I'm your host, Ted Genoways. If you liked this episode and you want to support our podcast, please share it with your friends, post about it on social media, and leave a rating and review. Switchyard is a production of the University of Tulsa and Public Radio Tulsa. We made this episode with executive producer Marianne Andre and Charles Lipper, Cass Ali, and Aaron Wald at Volubility Podcasting. Special thanks to the Church Studio.